Welcome back to Human Emotion. Today we're going to talk about the way that emotions shape the way we actually think. And here we'll try to answer some of the biggest questions that have plagued, scientists, psychologists, and even philosophers since the beginning of time, where we tried to think about, are emotions truly irrational, or can they actually help us think, and in what ways do they? So for example, we'll be answering questions such as, can emotion change our thinking? Can it change the way that we actually remember important life events? And can emotion change how we actually perceive the world, whether we view it through rosy-colored glasses or maybe more forlorn and dysphoric glasses? In other words, do we see the world, more Pollyanna, or as some people say, more as an Eeyore? So here, emotion and cognition were once thought to be really completely separate entities, and actually perhaps even in conflict with each other. And indeed, emotions were thought to be completely antithetical, or the opposite of what was thought to be higher order rational thinking and cognitive faculties. Recently, however, studies in emotion have found that this is absolutely not the case. And in fact, emotion and cognition actually overlap in really fascinating and intricate ways. So what we're going to study today is a little bit of the ways in which emotion and cognition may mutually shape each other and actually change the way that you think about the world merely by changing your current emotional state. So this is our first part of a three-part series on emotion and cognition. So in our introduction today, we're going to take a broad view to answer the question of, do feelings actually shape the way we think? And let me walk you through a roadmap of how we're going to do this today. We'll start by looking at the relationship between emotion and memory, followed by processing style, judgment, and then we'll conclude with our typical takeaway questions and expert interview. So today we'll start with looking at how emotion shapes the way we remember the world around us. And William James first had the initial, very prescient observation that indeed emotions must somehow influence the way we remember the world around us. He said, an impression may be so emotionally exciting as to leave a scar upon our cerebral tissues. So he indeed thought that emotions are so powerful that they'll leave this almost indelible mark upon our brain and the way we remember the world around us. Since William James, there's been questions that have really tried to more specifically look at the way in which emotions shape memories. In other words, do they make these mental marks upon us that are permanent and cannot be altered or even maybe mutated over time? So the first question we'll look at today is whether or not emotional memories indeed are indelible. So the original work here started in the 70s with this concept of flashbulb memories. So flashbulb memories are really like what you might think of a flashbulb sort of instant photograph of an event. So this is the phenomena whereby emotional memories are often recalled more vividly after an event. And they're actually recalled in almost this kind of photographic form, where you can know where you were, what was going on at the time, who told you the news at the time, how others felt, maybe how you felt, and sort of what happened next. So almost what emotions do is they sort of flash this light over what events are going on in the world around you so that you can store them in your mind, almost like a still frame or movie that you can play chronologically over time. So this is the idea of flashbulb memories, that emotions really create this almost permanent, indelible mark upon your memory. One example that's often talked about with flashbulb memories, and that many people in the U.S. can remember, is the terrorist attacks in 9/11. So many people will say they can remember where they were, what they were doing, what they were thinking when this happened. And this notion was also confirmed in the former President Bush's televised address to Congress in September, where he said, "Each of us will remember what happened that day and to whom it happened. We will remember the moment the news came, where we were, and what we were doing." Now, some researchers have actually argued against this idea that flashbulb memories exist. And if we see here in this study here where they say confidence, not consistency, characterizes flashbulb memories, if we peek at what they wrote, they would actually suggest that flashbulb memories are not special in their accuracy, as previously claimed, but only in their perceived accuracy, right? So what they did is they really questioned whether or not flashbulb memories actually exist. And they did this by comparing memories of one, the memory of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, with a second memory of just some normal everyday event to see whether or not really emotionally salient events actually indeed do leave these indelible marks upon our memory. And here's what they found. So they found some differences that you can see at the top left. So the differences are that people believe that flashbulb memories, such as those of 9/11, are more accurately and vividly remembered. And the intensity of emotions experienced during these events are related to people's greater confidence in their accuracy. So the more that we feel we had an intense emotion experience, the more confident we feel in thinking that these are indeed more vivid memories on our mind. However, there were actually no differences in whether or not 9/11 was more likely to be remembered than some everyday event, right? And in fact, what might be the case is that the memory for these kinds of emotionally salient, traumatic life events actually seems to decline at a similar rate over time for other more everyday, neutral or non-emotional information. So some might argue that flashbulb memories, such as those like 9/11, are only enduring because they become reinforced by the media. We've seen multiple repetitions of them time and time again, online, in the news, speaking to people in conversations, but the actual memory itself of when that happened in our own personal lives is no more memorable than any other everyday event. So interestingly here, this is another idea that's looking at distortion in memory for emotions. And here, what they found is it's asking this question of, is there memory for emotions themselves, right? So do we have an enhanced memory for emotional events? So the method that they did in this study is that they had students rate their anxiety level before a midterm, and then they recalled their anxiety level approximately 1 week later, before or after learning their grade. And the results suggest that compared to students who hadn't yet learned their grade, those who did learn that they did well on the test underestimated their pre-test anxiety, whereas students who did poorly overestimated their pre-test anxiety. So this merely suggests, when we think about emotions and memory, that information learned after the fact actually distorts your memory for the original emotions themselves. So, when we come to this first question, are emotional memories indelible? Not necessarily. Perhaps emotions don't really sort of seal memory in some special way. But what about the second question here of, do emotion states actually improve memory at all? So let's look at this second question. So even if emotion memories aren't indelible, do they play some role in helping to facilitate or influence our memories? So this is work by Gordon Bower. So Gordon Bower really pushed this idea forward of emotion congruence. And here what he did is he argued that emotions are part of these associative networks in our mind, and that each emotion has what he called interconnected images, concepts, labels, and interpretations. And what happens is that when you experience an emotion, so thinking of it as a node in the middle of a network, that these associations get activated, almost like if you think of an octopus in the center of the octopus and it spreads out with 8 branching legs. When that emotion gets activated, you see these associations that sort of merge or sort of spiral out, they get activated. So for an example, when you're in a happy mood, you're better able to remember associated happy memories or happy related information. And here's some evidence for emotion congruence. So he found that people are able to better remember information if they learn it and recall it in the same congruent emotional state. So if you learn something while you're in a fearful state, you're better able to recall that information later on if you're also in an anxious or fearful state than if you're in a happy state later on. And here's some evidence that he found. So if you look at this graph carefully, what you find is he looked at people who were induced into either a happy mood in yellow or a sad mood in blue. And what he did is he asked people to recall a number of either pleasant or unpleasant related memories that they had before the age of 15 that you can see here on the bottom. And what you're seeing in this graph is that in the happy mood, so if we follow the line in yellow, what we see is that people in a happy mood recall significantly more pleasant memories before they were 15. By contrast, people in a sad mood recall slightly more unpleasant memories than pleasant memories. So it suggests that our mood states give us some special access to information that is consistent with whatever state we're in. If we're happy, we can recall more positive information. If we're sad, we can recall more negative information. So he further pushed this idea of emotion congruence in another study. So the method in this study, he had subjects read a story about two guys who were playing tennis. And here's how it went. So Andre was playing tennis and he was happy. All was going well for him. Whereas Jack is sad, nothing's going well for him. So then they were asked to recall the story and asked them, the participants, who do you think is the central character? So the results suggested that happy readers remembered more statements about Andre, the happy character, and actually thought the story was about him, whereas sad readers remembered more statements about the sad character, Jack, and thought the story was about him. So there's some important caveats to keep in mind with emotion congruence. This was really Gordon Bauer and the field's first serious attempt to try to integrate emotion in models of learning and memory. So as a first attempt, there's always caveats, right? So first, we see emotion congruency and the graph we saw with the yellow and blue lines that seems to be stronger for positive than negative emotional information. And sometimes mood incongruent information can be better recalled. So while it's an interesting theory, there's still some caveats that need to be worked out as future research moves forward. So are emotion memories indelible? Not necessarily. But do emotions enhance memory at all? Well, I would say, why, yes, it seems that they do. But there's still some interesting caveats as to the role where we understand precisely how they do it. So we've talked a little bit about emotion and memory, and what I want to do now is move into this concept of processing style. And here we're going to look at the ways in which different kinds of mood states, positive or negative, shape the way that we process information just in the world around us. So now we're going to turn to processing style. So here, I want to show you a table, and what I want to walk through are some core differences between the ways positive emotions and negative emotions shape the way that we process information. So first, what we see here is that positive emotions really facilitate the use of what are called heuristics, or mental shortcuts, and they actually cause us to engage in more stereotype-related thinking. So in other words, positive emotions really kind of move us through these kind of information-related processes by just taking more quick mental shortcuts. Whereas negative emotions seem to almost slow us down in some ways and facilitate more careful, more analytical, more detail-oriented types of thinking. As a result, you can see positive emotions, what they do is they really seem to promote this kind of broader, kind of creative thinking. You're sort of focused less on the details of a particular situation that you're in, and you're really kind of expanding and broadening your cognitive repertoire, right? Whereas again, negative emotions, it's more analytical thought and promotes really more kind of detail-oriented, concrete thinking. So they each are seeming to serve really different types of cognitive functions. Not surprisingly, positive emotions are thought to facilitate what's called a global focus. They kind of keep us focused on, you can think of it as the forest, whereas negative emotions are really about honing in and focusing on the trees. Not surprisingly, there's been some empirical work by Barb Fredrickson and colleagues that positive emotions really do seem to support this broader focus of attention, whereas by contrast, negative emotions are promoting narrowed attention and focus really on the situational details. So the way I like to think about it is I think of negative emotions as almost putting on these blinders and getting you really zeroed in on a very concrete task right in front of you. So imagine if there was a bear in front of you or a snake. You don't want to be sort of paying attention to the landscape as a whole and engaging in creative thinking. You want to focus in narrowly on how you're going to either fight or flee that given dangerous cue, be it a snake, bear, etc. Whereas positive emotions really signal to us that we're in a place of safety, so we can kind of take a step back, we can broaden our attentional scope, we can engage in creative thinking, and we don't necessarily need to take the kind of careful analytical steps that are involved when we're in a more negative emotional situation or environment. So these are different types of processing styles that are associated with positive and negative emotions. The one caveat you can see here on the bottom corner is that says, quote, asterisk, except anger. So anger's been this really interesting, mysterious emotion because on the one hand, we all think of it as being negatively valenced, but on the other hand, what it actually does is it shares a lot of the same processing style features of positive emotions. So it's a really exciting mystery in the field that we'll definitely talk about later in the course. But when we think about sort of what kind of state do you want to be in, if you're really trying to think carefully and get things right, there's a lot of controversy on this, right? So on the one hand, you can imagine people who are engaged in sort of artistic endeavors, writers, musicians, poets, saying that positive emotions are really what you need to sort of get ahead in your creative, cognitive endeavors, whereas others might say with negative emotions that you really want to be in maybe a bad mood. So this is an article that says, be sad and succeed. People in a bad mood have better judgment and pay more attention to details. So I think for yourself for a moment, what kind of mood states have you been in when you've been able to think the most clearly and achieve the goals that you are most interested in working on? So I recommend you looking at some of the work here of Joe Forgas, who's at the University of New South Wales, if you're interested in further exploring this topic. And here, as you can say, it says, grumpy people paid closer attention to details, showed less gullibility, were less prone to errors of judgment, and formed higher quality, persuasive arguments than their happy counterparts. One study even supports the notion that those who showed either signs of fear, anger, or sadness also seemed to do better in eyewitness recall studies. So again, take a look if you're interested in learning more about this, of the way in which being sad may actually help you think more carefully and more closely. So another way in which we look at how emotions shape our processing style of the world is by looking at patterns of attentional bias, or the ways in which we literally view the world and what ways emotions may actually shape the lenses through which we see the world. So here, researchers looking at attention-related biases will ask questions like, if people are in a positive mood, do they have what's called a positive attentional bias? Are they more prone to visually orient and pay attention to cues in the environment that are positive or rewarding? Likewise, there's been work, especially in anxiety and depression, showing that people in these negative mood states show an enhanced negative attentional bias. They actually spend more time looking at negative emotional information if you present them with different types of images, emotional faces, some of the IAPS photos we talked about earlier in course, etc. So emotions also seem to shape the lens through which we view the world. And there's a couple different paradigms that people use to test this. I'll briefly walk you through now. One of them is called edit that. One of them is called an eye tracking task. So eye tracking tasks are really interesting, and what they enable you to do is look at attention-related biases. So using eye tracking technology, you can actually unobtrusively and continuously monitor an individual's point of gaze using an infrared light beam by looking at where their eyes are orienting on a computer screen while they're viewing standardized positive, negative, or even neutral picture stimuli, word stimuli, etc. And another type of very popular paradigm here is what's called dot probe tasks. So dot probe tasks are also very helpful in that they enable you to more directly assess potential biases and patterns of attentional distribution, often showing simultaneous images on a screen, such as a sad and happy face, and looking at where people attend to and respond to first. So importantly, when we think about a positive emotion and cognition, it's vitally important to know Barbara Fredrickson's broaden and build theory of positive emotions. So her theory suggests that positive emotions exist to build an individual's resources necessary for survival. And she would say they do so by broadening one's thought processes and creating a wider than normal array of thoughts, behaviors, and perceptions. And this cognitive broadening actually results in more creative, integrative, and future-oriented and efficient thinking. And she would say this facilitates the discovery of new knowledges and builds vital social and cognitive resources. So the broaden and build theory has been monumental in really explaining links between the ways that positive emotion can influence directly creative thinking and efficient thinking. So this is something that's in your readings, and I suggest reading further as we think about the ways in which positive emotions specifically can affect our cognitive processes. So what I want to conclude now with is the ways in which emotions influence judgments or everyday types of decisions. Here, one of the most influential theories is by Dr. Gerald Clore at the University of Virginia, who really put forward his theory that's been absolutely pioneering in this domain called affective information. And really what it stipulates is that emotions are informative. They give us information when we're making important judgments. So we need to pay attention to them as cues of information in order to make everyday choices and decisions. Why might emotions be so important in this way? Well, first, he would argue that they provide us with a quick, rapid signal about our environment. And second, many judgments in everyday life are often too complex to take in all information. So we often have to be quicker and rely on a more simple assessment of our current feelings in order to make quick judgments in the moment. So in other words, emotions can sort of serve as heuristics for us. And he did a really landmark study here when he was really piloting or pioneering his affect as information theory as follows. So he had a study that went as follows. So in the first condition that you see on the left, he asked people, calling them on a day that was either cloudy or sunny, and asking them, all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? And in the second condition, he first asked them, well, how's the weather today? Is it sunny? Is it cloudy and rainy? And then he asked them the same question, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? What he found is that people, and this is what he predicted, it's really interesting, that those who had not been asked about the weather in condition 1 would use their current feelings as information to make complex judgments such as how satisfied they are with their life as a whole, whereas those in condition 2 who were first asked about the weather, he reasoned, would no longer use their feelings in making these complex judgments. So in sum, what he found is that people use emotions as these heuristics or shortcuts in making judgments, except when they attribute their feelings to a certain source, such as the weather. So, not surprisingly, you find that people in this condition are reporting feeling more satisfied with their life as a whole when the weather is sunny as opposed to cloudy. But you see this effect sort of mitigate once they can attribute it to the weather, and you no longer see as pronounced of an effect on ratings of life satisfaction. And here you can see this is some of the data that came from it that we just talked about, where, again, what we're seeing in condition 1, that people are rating higher life satisfaction when the weather is sunny in white as compared to when it's overcast in gray, but that once you sort of cue them in to attributing their emotions to the weather, you no longer see differences in life satisfaction as a result of the weather. So again, people are using emotions as heuristics or shortcuts in making judgments, except when they can attribute their feelings to a specific source. So again, this is a really remarkable finding, and let me just emphasize why. So this perspective says that what we are doing is using what we're feeling in the moment and attributing our feelings to some other source, right? And if our attention is drawn to something else that may be influencing our feelings, like the weather, we no longer use our feelings as information to help make judgments, and really big judgments such as how satisfied are we with our life as a whole. So it's a powerful effect. It's been replicated in many labs, and in fact feelings do seem to influence our judgments until we attach those feelings to other things. So what I want to do now is conclude with our takeaway questions and our expert interview. So for our takeaway questions today, this is our first introduction into the realm of emotion and cognition. The first question really starts at the beginning of our lecture, asking, what are flashbulb memories, and is there supportive empirical evidence? 2, what is the broaden and build theory of positive emotion, posited by Barbara Fredrickson, and how does it explain the effect of positive emotion on cognition? And importantly, I want you to also think about the different processing styles we spoke about that compare the way positive emotion affects cognition as compared to negative emotion. Finally, what is the affect as information theory that we just spoke about, put forth by Gerald Clore, and how does it explain the ways in which emotion might influence everyday judgments, such as how satisfied are you feeling with your life as a whole today? Now we'll turn to our expert interview. And this is part of the Experts in Emotion interview series. Today we'll be speaking with Dr. Gerald Clore on emotion and cognition. Dr. Clore is a Commonwealth Professor of Psychology at the University of Virginia and formerly an Alumni Distinguished Professor at the University of Illinois. His research focuses on emotion and its cognitive consequences. He's co-authored The Cognitive Structure of Emotions, a general theory of how psychological situations elicit emotions and make them intense. Its chief application is in computer science as the emotion engine of intelligent agents in robots, computer games, and interactive training modules. His research has been funded by both the NIMH and NSF and concerns the affect as information hypothesis, which clarifies how emotional information about value and urgency help to shape or regulate cognition, motivation, and even memory. Dr. Clore has served as an associate editor of Cognition and Emotion, as faculty in the NIMH Consortium on Emotion, and as a visiting professor at Harvard University. He's also been a visiting scholar at Harvard, Oxford, and New York University, and a fellow of the Centers for Advanced Study at Illinois, Stanford, and the Rockefeller Center in Italy. In 2010, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in 2013, he received the William James Award for Scientific Achievement from the Association for Psychological Science. So I now turn to a very special Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Gerald Clore. This is our first part of a three-part series on emotion and cognition. So in our introduction today, we're going to take a broad view to answer the question of, do feelings actually shape the way we think? And let me walk you through a roadmap of how we're going to do this today. We'll start by looking at the relationship between emotion and memory, followed by processing style, judgment, and then we'll conclude with our typical takeaway questions and expert interview. So today we'll start with looking at how emotion shapes the way we remember the world around us. And William James first had the initial, very prescient observation that indeed emotions must somehow influence the way we remember the world around us. He said, an impression may be so emotionally exciting as to leave a scar upon our cerebral tissues. So he indeed thought that it called in almost this kind of photographic form, where you can know where you were, what was going on at the time, who told you the news at the time, how others felt, maybe how you felt, and sort of what happened next. So almost what emotions do is they sort of flash this light over what events are going on in the world around you so that you can store them in your mind, almost like a still frame or movie that you can play chronologically over time. So this is the idea of flashbulb memories, that emotions really create this almost permanent, indelible mark upon your memory. One example that's often talked about with flashbulb memories, and that many people in the U.S. can remember, is the terrorist attacks in 9/11. So many people will say they can remember where they were, what they were doing, what they were thinking when this happened. And this notion was also confirmed in the former President Bush. Emotions are so powerful that they'll leave this almost indelible mark upon our brain and the way we remember the world around us. Since William James, there's been questions that have really tried to more specifically look at the way in which emotions shape memories. In other words, do they make these mental marks upon us that are permanent and cannot be altered or even maybe mutated over time? So the first question we'll look at today is whether or not emotional memories indeed are indelible. So the original work here started in the 70s with this concept of flashbulb memories. So flashbulb memories are really like what you might think of a flashbulb sort of instant photograph of an event. So this is the phenomena whereby emotional memories are often recalled more vividly after an event. And they're actually recalled. Welcome back to Human Emotion. Today we're going to talk about the way that emotions shape the way we actually think. And here we'll try to answer some of the biggest questions that have plagued, scientists, psychologists, and even philosophers since the beginning of time, where we tried to think about, are emotions truly irrational, or can they actually help us think, and in what ways do they? So for example, we'll be answering questions such as, can emotion change our thinking? Can it change the way that we actually remember important life events? And can emotion change how we actually perceive the world, whether we view it through rosy-colored glasses or maybe more forlorn and dysphoric glasses? In other words, do we see the world, more Pollyanna, or as some people say, more as an Eeyore? So here, emotion and cognition were once thought to be really completely separate entities, and actually perhaps even in conflict with each other. And indeed, emotions were thought to be completely antithetical, or the opposite of what was thought to be higher order rational thinking and cognitive faculties. Recently, however, studies in emotion have found that this is absolutely not the case. And in fact, emotion and cognition actually overlap in really fascinating and intricate ways. So what we're going to study today is a little bit of the ways in which emotion and cognition may mutually shape each other and actually change the way that you think about the world merely by changing your current emotional state. So this